Hey homies, how's it going? It's the Tominator, and today we're going to be talking about the shift that seems to be happening in the IFBB men's open bodybuilding division right now, with the trim waistlines and all this talk about vacuums and just the overall emphasis on the midsection making a comeback. Because for many years, decades really, contests were said to be won and lost from the back. A pleasing midsection, however, was typically more of an afterthought. Nowhere was this more true than on the biggest stage of them all, the Mr. Olympia competition, where for the better part of the past 35 years or so, the reigning champ was pretty much always the man with the best back. Samir Banu started it off back in 1983 with mind-blowing detail and development that was unprecedented at the time. I mean, these back shots would hold up well even by today's standards, and he would likely be winning in classic physique, assuming he made the weight cap and brought this level of conditioning. Lee Haney then continued the trend by just dominating the remainder of the 80s with one of the best V-tapers the sport had ever seen. The low, thick lats cinching down into that tiny waist gave his powerful physique an aesthetic appeal that few mass monsters could possibly rival. Really, him and Schwarzenegger were practically in a class of their own when it came to these twisting back poses. When Haney retired in 1991, the torch was passed to the next man in line, the upcoming British juggernaut nicknamed the Shadow, Dorian Yates. Yates brought a freakier element to the table, ushering in the mass monster age in 1993 and owning the better part of the 90s by virtue of his outstanding size, rock-solid conditioning, and arguably the best back of all time. Ronnie Coleman, in many ways, like an even larger version of Yates, then took over and continued to push the envelope of what was humanly possible, practically leaving humanity behind in the process in 2003 when he showed up ripped at 287 pounds, and just destroyed the lineup. Unfortunately, this period during the early to mid-2000s was also when bodybuilding took a turn for the worst, with this all-out pursuit for mass often leading to compromised conditioning, and even worse, resulting in the arrival of distended midsections. The so-called bubble gut era was arguably born during Yates' reign in the mid to late 1990s, but it had become a full-on epidemic a decade later. In 2006, when Jay Cutler finally seized the title away from his longtime rival Ronnie Coleman, we saw two massive, beefy, watery, big-waisted behemoths battling it out on stage with little to offer in the way of shape or symmetry. Size was the name of the game, and while Jay never had the best back, certainly not in comparison to the four Mr. Olympia champions who preceded him, he was still thick and wide and big as hell. Dexter Jackson was the opposite in that respect, not the biggest, but definitely packing a ton of detail and polish into those back shots. And of course, Jay would go on to reclaim the Sandow for 2 more years before ultimately being supplanted by his one-time protege, Phil Heath, in 2011, who would go on to repeat for the following 6 years. Phil, like Dexter Banu, was never the widest, but his back was absolutely jam-packed with extraordinary detail and depth. And now, as of 2018, we have this. Now, Sean Roden is a great bodybuilder, don't get me wrong, but it would be a stretch to say he has a great back, especially by Mr. Olympia standards. It's slightly above average at best. Certainly any of these other aforementioned bodybuilders would clean his clock when it comes to the 2 back compulsories. Yes, even Jay or Dexter, who would overpower him with size and detail respectively. But what Roden has instead is one of the best ab and thigh poses of the modern era, even of all time you could say. His midsection is top-notch, a fully defined six-pack on a tiny waist. His quads are also full and striated, and he absolutely owns this pose today so long as he's in shape. So how did it come to this? As we just established, the man who won from the back, in particular the rear double biceps pose, was typically the man to go on to win the show. Now it would seem that perhaps the man with the better ab and thigh ought to be considered the favorite. I mean, how else are we to explain Roden defeating Phil Heath at the 2018 Mr. Olympia, or Brandon Curry prevailing against William Bonac at the 2019 Arnold Classic? In both cases, the winner was certainly packing less muscle onto their frame, but presented cleaner lines and a much tighter midsection. Now, aside from the obvious explanation that the IFBB is pushing for more aesthetic physiques with more mainstream appeal, largely in response to all the backlash these so-called bubble guts have generated on social media over the past couple years, I propose another reason to add to that. And it comes down to a matter of rarity. Supply and demand, if you will. It's just basic economics that we tend to value rare items more than common ones. It's why diamonds and gold are more valuable than, say, wood and iron. There's nothing inherently better about these shiny materials, but we place more value onto them mainly because of their rarity. I feel the same logic applies in this case to bodybuilding as well. See, during the 80s and 90s and even the 2000s, a world-class back was a rare sight. It was tough to find a back double bicep or a rear lat spread that could compare to the Benus or the Haneys or the Yates, the Colemans. It still is for that matter. But great ab and thigh poses were practically a dime a dozen. It was unusual for a bodybuilder during the 80s or 90s to have a genuinely poor midsection, because back then guys weren't as monstrous as they are today. They weren't eating as much or injecting themselves with the same ludicrous amounts of HGH or insulin as their 21st century counterparts, so as a result they weren't blowing out their midsections, and washboard abs and flat stomachs were the norm. But building a thick, dense back with muscle on top of muscle, that was a rare sight indeed. And so the back shots were what tended to be a deciding factor and push certain guys over the top. Would Dorian Yates have won so many Sandows with a mediocre back? Highly doubtful. Same goes for Haney and Ronnie or Phil as well. The back double biceps was the knockout blow these titans used to smash their competition. The reason being is that this pose is the one, above all others, that showcases the most muscularity. Never mind the most muscular pose, that's really a misnomer, because all you're really showing off in that one is the traps, shoulders, pecs, arms, and quads to a lesser extent. Even the abs are largely hidden depending on how it's executed. The back double biceps, however, puts the following on full display. The lats, teres, traps, all three heads of the deltoids, the biceps, brachialis, triceps, brachioradialis, spinal erectors, glutes, hamstrings, and calves. No other mandatory pose showcases as many distinct muscle groups as this one, and no other pose is as telling an indicator of great conditioning either, as the glutes, hamstrings, and lower back are typically some of the most difficult areas to get dry and shredded. That's why I feel like the back double biceps has historically been the most important pose at the Olympia level, because not only does it separate the elite bodybuilders in terms of back development and muscular density, but it's also the clearest indicator of crisp conditioning. And what have I said about bodybuilding criteria time and time again? The winning formula has always tended to be that combination of mass plus conditioning. Symmetry, proportion, stage presence, these are all secondary criteria. Important to be sure, but not sufficient enough on their own to win big shows. But nowadays, I'm not so sure that's the case anymore. Conditioning is still critical, no question. If Roden or Curry hadn't been in peak shape, there's no way they would have been able to beat the likes of Heath and Bonac. Likewise, if they were too small, you have to at least be competitive size-wise or you're going to get overlooked. And world-class backs are still a relative rarity in the pro ranks today, let's not get it twisted. Only a handful of guys have exceptional backs out there, and you can probably count them on one hand. Bonac, Dexter, Curry, Cedric perhaps, Big Ramy if he's conditioned, but that's about it. Of course we could add Kai Green and Phil Heath to the list if either of them decide to make a comeback, but it's definitely an exclusive club. But then again, how many top bodybuilders boast a great midsection either? That's the thing here. In this day and age of insulin-fueled mass monsters, a trim waistline has become increasingly rare, almost as uncommon as a world-class back. Think about it, how many of the top guys has a truly great midsection today? And by top guys, I mean like top 10 material at the Olympia here. Roden, Curry, Rolly if he nails it, Luke Sando maybe, that's about it. Big Ramy's waistline is decent, but not as small as it used to be. Ditto for Dexter, Cedric, and Nathan DeAsha. Gone are the days where almost all of the top guys sported a stellar set of abs. This isn't the 90s anymore, where aesthetic icons like Flex Wheeler, Sean Ray, Lee Priest, Kevin Levrone, Paul Dillette, etc. would all headline that top call-out. So I think that's why suddenly the ab and thigh pose is beginning to receive more recognition, because a good ab and thigh shot is no longer the norm. Never mind the vacuum pose, even a great standard ab and thigh has become like a lost art. So do I think the back poses are no longer important, or that the guy with the best midsection is going to win all the time? Of course not. If that was the case, there's no way in hell Cedric McMillan would have lost to William Bonac at this year's Australian Arnold Classic. My point here is that the back shots may no longer be as all-important as they once were, and the ab and thigh pose, which for many years seemed to be something of a black sheep, the least valued of the 8 mandatories, is now becoming more essential. I think it's a good thing in the sense that they should be rewarding more complete and proportionate physiques with proper tapers and stop turning a blind eye to these unsightly bloated bellies. But anyway, that's just my opinion based on recent results. It could all just be a coincidence, but at this point, I don't think so. I think there's definitely some change in the wind here in the IFBB recently, and they seem to be pushing for a more aesthetic ideal with a renewed emphasis on streamlined waists. So that's it for this one. What do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, just a heads up, but I'll be flying out to Arizona to see the folks this weekend for a little vacation. So unfortunately, I won't be around to cover the Indy Pro, at least not in a timely fashion. Hopefully, once I'm back later next week, I'll be able to revisit it and do a recap or something. But just wanted to let you guys know that, so don't hold your breath or anything waiting for my review. But anyway, thanks for watching, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more. Until next time, I'm the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back.